Good morning and welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Albany. My name is Peggy Sherman and I'm the Service Associate today. Before we begin, please check to make sure your microphone is muted. You can also turn your camera off if your image is potentially distracting. Please also be mindful of your speech while on Zoom, as microphones can accidentally become unmuted. This will minimize any disruption of our service. You will notice closed captioning at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to turn that off or on, find the CC option on your Zoom toolbar and select the up arrow to access it. Thanks so much for your cooperation. This is now the time of transition from ordinary time to sacred time. Time to check in with your body, to collect your attention, to be present in the moment. Let this moment be separated from yesterday and tomorrow. May this virtual space become a sanctuary for the next hour. Allow your screen to transform into a virtual community hall, to experience images, sounds, and music, songs, poetry, and prose that will lift your heart, broaden your mind, and move you to do justice in this world in the service of building beloved community. May this virtual service be holy time for each of us that joins us together in celebration of life. Our prelude is Let My People Go, I'm on my way, traditional spiritual and African-American gospel medley performed by Bruce Holden. Please join in the chalice lighting with the words shown on the screen. Welcoming all free seekers of truth and meaning, we gather to excite the human spirit, to inspire its growth and development, to respond morally and ethically to a troubled world, and to sustain a vital and nurturing religious community. Next, we'll sing a unison song. The words will appear on your screen. Please join in singing Spirit of Life by Carolyn McDade, led by Chris Jensen. Welcome to our viewers from Facebook who will be joining us now for our service. I'm Peggy Sherman and I'm the Service Associate today. This morning, we're happy to have in our pulpit Dr. Jennifer Burns, who is a professor of history in the Africana Studies Department at the State University of New York at Albany. She also received her Masters and Doctoral degrees from the University at Albany with a concentration in local Black history. Professor Burns is a commentator on WAMC's Roundtable program, is a board member of the Underground Railroad Education Center and the Hart Cluett Museum, and is active in curriculum development and community education. Welcome, Dr. Burns.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for inviting me into your sanctuary and for allowing me to be a part of your service and the good work that you are trying to do in the community. First, I would like to give a reading, and that reading comes from Isaiah, and it is Isaiah book 58, verse 6, and that is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry, and he will say, Here I am. If you take away from the midst of you the yoke, the pointing of the finger, and speaking wickedness, if you pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then shall your light rise in the darkness, and your gloom be as the noonday. And the Lord will guide you continually, and satisfy your desire with good things, and make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water, whose waters fail not. And your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall rise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach and restorer of streets to dwell in. And as I begin to go into what I prepared today, I'm going to return to Isaiah, because my talk here is really about reparations. And I am not here to ask you to join full-fledged in a reparations movement. I'm going to ask you to think more about your surroundings, the streets and your dwellings, and the yoke that still holds many of us today. And because I am a historian, I always like to start with our surrounding and our history, in particular in this Albany area, and connected to your church. And so with that, I know some of you know the history of enslavement when it comes to the Unitarian and the Universalist Church, but I think it's important for us to really think about how progressive people were, but also how divided the church could be, meaning that some really still supported racialized slavery in this area and nationwide, and built that into the structure and the laws of Albany County, of Albany City, but also of the nation. And the progressive movements within the church really begin during the colonial period. And that is a tremendous victory, because very few people in America were going to be true abolitionists and looking for ways for equality for people with brown skin or people of African descent. This covers people in Philadelphia like Reverend Benjamin Rush, who was one of the powerhouse educators for African Americans in this country, who worked closely with future Black reverends who were very radical. And radical, not in the same sense we use it today, but in a sense calling for human rights and the abolition of an institution that was corrupting all churches and morality. Benjamin Rush was connected with many of the leading Black pastors and teaching, molding, and creating a relationship that helped sustain the Underground Railroad, that ended up connecting right to Albany through people like Stephen and Harriet Myers down in the Arbor Hill area, right? And Livingston Ave, some of you may have been to that location. Benjamin Rush's relationship, right? It also extended into places like Massachusetts, as did people like Harriet and Stephen Myers and their families and their close allies that were African American, like Nathaniel Paul, who some of you may have heard of and you know is buried in Albany Rural Cemetery. Out of Massachusetts came many of the people like David Ruggles, connected in New York City, and Lydia Marie Child, who all then worked in a non-denominational fashion for the betterment of the community and for the abolition of slavery. by the 1840s in Albany. The Unitarians, the Universalists were very strong, but they were also still very divided over the issue of Black equality in Albany and nationwide. There were people who protested against products that were produced by slave labor within the church, but there were also others who monetarily were connected to the institution of banking, of slavery, through banking and the shipping industry. And that meant their wealth relied on what was happening to African Americans who were enslaved. To make this even more complicated, of course, we must add politics, because we want our church and state to be separate, but they're always intertwined and have always been. And so one of the leading Unitarians in the country was John C. Calhoun, who was the vice president for John Quincy Adams and for Andrew Jackson. He came through this area on a tour, and what he promoted was the defense of slavery and the deportation of African Americans who were free and living in this area and in other parts of the country. And this was divisive within the church. But then it didn't really get better. One of the tactics to make it better was led by Unitarian Millard Fillmore, who became president as well. He did not own slaves. He did not condone slavery, but he did sign the Fugitive Slave Acts. And that essentially removed the possibility, legally, of Albany being a sanctuary city that many of the African Americans and other Unitarians and other Universalists wanted it to be for free and enslaved Black people. Now, I start here with slavery really because when we talk about reparations, a lot of people always want to go to slavery. And yes, that's part of this foundation. But what happens after slavery is really critical to understanding the yoke that still captures us today, and that really encompasses the reparation conversation, but people often leave out. When, after the Civil War, people began to organize what were really an extension within the Black community of what was already happening. And those organizations that they organized were things that replicated vigilance committees, and Albany had a very strong vigilance committee, which was fighting for Black civil rights and Black freedom before the Civil War. That gets revived after the Civil War in Albany. And the members are people who were soldiers during the Civil War of African descent, who fought for freedom. They fought to change the laws, they fought to change the policies. And they are some of the first members then who organized things like the NAACP and the National Urban League in Albany. With that, we have to pay attention to our spatial surroundings and where people were, because they were largely in what becomes then, and still is today, Arbor Hill and the South End. And they're there because of racial segregation that wasn't necessarily written into law before the Civil War, but becomes the law of the land afterward. And while many people focus a lot on the South and that very stark colored and white, those signs of segregation, right here at Albany and in this area, those same things occurred, just done differently. At the same time, the leadership starts to change a little bit. And one of the major leaders in Albany during this period is a man named William H. Johnson. And William H. Johnson had escaped from slavery. He had fought in the Civil War. He relocates to Albany, and he becomes one of the leading civil rights figures in the area. And what he's challenging is segregated education, because before the Civil War and after the Civil War, in Albany, schools were still racially segregated. In 1872, he was able to push the Senate to actually eliminate racial segregation in Albany. The other thing that he deeply advocated for with others in the area, like Stephen Myers, was for voting rights, equal voting rights for Black men. And what this means is really before the Civil War, Black people in Albany who were free, in particular Black men, were not able to vote. They were not able to participate in what was shaping the environment, the community, the laws in the area. Black men in New York State, with the help of William Johnson and others, got the right to vote equally with white men in New York State due to the 15th Amendment. And that was the federal legislation focused on empowering former enslaved people to vote. The same year that Black men in New York State had this legislation passed for equal voting, New York State itself, before the 15th Amendment, had refused it. So the North was not as liberal. It was not as powerful as we want to think it, and it was not as built on as much equality as we want to look back and trust. And that lasted after the Civil War. Johnson, of course, did all of this as the head janitor for the New York State Senate. When we look back and we think about our leadership in the past in this Albany area, and we hear those huge accomplishments, we often think that those people were lawyers and they were doctors. But in the Black community, the leaders were prohibited and barred from many of those positions, and this impacted them economically as well. I say this because being part of that service industry has been a long tradition in Albany, but it doesn't mean that African Americans haven't pushed for that, pushed through it, and worked to try every avenue they could to change or break the yokes that were attached from the past. Stephen Johnson also saw that there was discrimination in the insurance industry, insuring property, insuring homes. He was able to get legislation passed for that too in 1891, again, by working senators, but he himself as the janitor who cleaned their building. When William Johnson passed away in 1918, there was a push in the area that was done by the KKK. And that is called the Second KKK movement, followed by the film like Birth of a Nation and other things like that. At the same time, what was happening in this area was that trickle that becomes the scream of the Great Migration of African Americans who were looking for Albany and the churches and the people to be their sanctuary city during the Jim Crow era. One of those migrants is a woman that some of you are familiar with, you may have known or have heard of, and her name is all over in Albany, and that is Ida Yarborough. Ida Yarborough came to Albany as a young widow with a young son, John Jennings, who some of you may have known or have heard of. When she moved in the same year William Johnson died in 1918, Henry Johnson was shipping out as one of the Harlem Hellfighters to go fight in the World Wars. At the same time, Albany was transitioning, and redlining and racial covenants were becoming part of the city landscape. Arbor Hill and other areas were becoming the zones that you don't invest in and you don't give loans to, coupled with the fact that there was racial covenants written into housing deeds outside those areas that prohibited those homes from being sold to Black people, regardless of what their income or what their job was. Now, while this was happening, we must remember the changing nature of the city, because against this backdrop, your church was purchased and bought. And to the left and to the right of it and to the south of it were those redlined areas where African Americans could not move out. In 1940, 1% of the Albany population was Black. By 1960, 12% was. At the same time, there was a tremendous movement of white people out of the city to Colony, to Bethlehem, to Latham, to Guilderland, some with the benefits of the GI Bill. And even though African Americans fought in World War I and World War II like Henry Johnson did, the housing deeds in those new construction projects prohibited them from leaving. At the same time, what we saw happen was the continuation of this kind of pigeonholing and job discrimination, again, a yoke of the past, on African Americans. This meant that between 1930 and the 1960s, residents in Albany who were African American were making nearly $700 less annually than white people for the same jobs. Now, we're familiar with some of this, but perhaps what we don't always consider is that in 1962, while the civil rights movement is raging in the South, and all of us, many of us in Albany and elsewhere in the North are looking down at the South and saying how backwards and decrepit and old and hateful it was, there were things that were operating here that were so similar, and that is controlling people's free will, free ability, and equity. And it was done by complexion. In 1962, when the Empire State Plaza was being built, eminent domain took 98 acres of the area in the downtown city, roughly forcing about 7,000 people, businesses, and homes, right, buildings, things to be removed. However, while that was taking place, the other thing that was happening was that contract buying and rent-to-own scams were happening in the redlined areas where African Americans predominantly were. And what that meant was that they typically got homes that were in areas that said the homes were of lesser value. These rent-to-own scams were also supported in many ways by the Albany County political figures. And one of the ways in which this was done was that within the contracts of the houses, if a Black family who were to get into a rent-to-own situation, if they missed a payment, their contract was null and void and they could no longer buy this house. However, the taxes for it had to still be paid. And so what would happen is this back and forth between Albany County and the homeowners. And essentially, nobody really paid them. It resulted in over $8 million of delinquent taxes. And now I know this sounds like, why would we talk about this when we're talking about reparations? Or why would we talk about this when we're talking about what we can do today? But the key to understanding this is really to look around and say, oh, when I see one of those big red X's on the buildings in many of these redlined areas, I realize now, or I see now, that it wasn't simply because of people who maybe didn't try so hard or just couldn't financially, make ends meet, or maybe are lazy, as some of the stereotypes go. But the reality is that when people are able to avoid the changing and much necessary progressive measures to create equality, to offer opportunity, not only in Albany, but outside, it is deeply connected to tax dollars, and it's deeply connected to a history, a yoke that continues to perpetuate into the future. Now, these areas, of course, are going to continue to struggle, and they struggle today. One of the major things about this is that when we look back at the past and we think of people like Ida Yarborough, she was one of the major fighters against this. She, and then many of you know or have heard of the brothers. What they were doing was advocating for the North and for Albany to look at how they had already been practicing a racial segregation, very similar to the South. It just wasn't labeled on every corner with colored and white signs. One of the reasons that the area continued to decline, perpetually trapping it as redlined and dilapidated areas, was because the taxes weren't being paid. Also because what was put on the residents were simple things like garbage pickup. You had to privately pay for that. But if people are being, annually are not making enough money to be able to survive, or equivalent money to others, they absolutely can't pay for now what the city covers, like trash removal. That was not done until 1967 through the efforts of people like Ida Yarborough and the brothers. Now, one of the other things that we're all familiar with is that this has ripple effects. It then impacts schools and how they become racially segregated. And that's exactly what took place in Albany. In the 1960s, the New York State Education Commissioner found that 24 school districts, which included 59 schools right in our area, were still racially segregated. So even though William Johnson and others worked so hard to desegregate schools, those housing patterns recreated that in a different way. It established a new and different yoke. Today, we see the same pattern. Today, when we walk Henry Johnson Boulevard, when we think about perhaps what Governor Cuomo and others have done when it comes to revitalizing Ida Yarborough housing, we have to ask ourselves, is this just a repeat of what happened earlier in 1971 when they proposed the Ida Yarborough homes? They built them and the construction was pretty shoddy. And what happened was a perpetuation of the same economic situation, of the same school patterns, and of the same inability, but through a different way, for African Americans to access home ownership. So while our efforts today are good at creating sanctuaries, and we believe it and we're trying, we must reimagine how we do it. We must remember that we inherited this past, but we have the power today to reimagine and repair it. Lastly, as we walk the streets in Albany, as we drive across Henry Johnson Boulevard, as you leave your homes and you go to the church, and hopefully soon we're doing it more and more physically, I hope that we start to think about all of the African Americans to the left, to the right, down the streets and through the windows that we see, who as they are congregating, as they are advocating for those neighborhoods to be altered and remedied and repaired, we remember that it's not just a today problem that we're looking to fix. It's a generational problem that has developed over decades, not far away, not in the South, but right here in our area. And so I say, if we can restore, if we can fix, if we can help, and if we can repair by thinking about the longevity of this yoke, then we shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. And so, therefore, I ask, who did your church help? And I thank you for hearing and having me share my word today during your service.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burns. An important way we celebrate life each Sunday is by offering an opportunity to practice generosity. Members and friends support our congregation with an annual pledge paid throughout the year. Another way to support the good work of this congregation is by making a generous contribution via one of the options shown on the next slide. You can click on the tiny URL link in the chat window to contribute, or you can send a text to the number shown on the screen. The examples on the slide show how to label your text to indicate the amount and the purpose or intent of your gift. We now say goodbye to our Facebook viewers. Consider joining us on Zoom next time by visiting albanyuu.org. For our offertory music, we have two pieces by Simon and Garfunkel. arranged and performed by Bruce Holden. Please join in singing This Little Light of Mine, an African-American spiritual led by Bruce Holden. As we extinguish the chalice, please join in the words shown on the screen. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. And for our benediction, I have words written by Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson, and she draws on the words of June Jordan in Poem for South African Women, which she presented at the UN on August 9th, 1978. We are the ones we have been waiting for. We are not perfect, but we are perfectly fitted for this day. We are not without fault, but we can be honest to face our past as we chart a new future. We are the ones we have been waiting for. May we be bold and courageous to chart that new future. May we have faith in a future that is not known. We are the ones we have been waiting for. And let us thank our musicians, Bruce Holden and Chris Jensen, our pastoral care associate, Eric Van Housen. I'm your service associate. Tammy Hathaway and Annika Pfluger were our ushers. Barbara Manning was our welcomer. Office support provided by Tammy Hathaway and Patience Pichette. Technical support from Chris Jensen, and Randy Rosette is our summer service coordinator.